This is going to be a video on business analysis technical questions. These questions came directly from ChatGPT. So I asked it, ChatGPT, give me some technical business analysis interview questions, and I'm going to do my best to answer them as clearly as possible and give you some advice on how to answer some of these questions. Once again, I'm doing this without much prep. I did read through it one time, but I didn't really sit down and prep the way I would if I myself was interviewing. So I may not be able to come up with examples as quickly on the fly, but let's see how it goes. This first category from ChatGPT is general technical questions. Requirements gathering. How do you prioritize competing business requirements from stakeholders? This one's pretty straightforward in my mind. If there's competing business requirements from stakeholders, that means there's a lack of understanding somewhere. In the BA world, it's usually not something like somebody wants the wall to be orange and somebody else wants it to be blue. It's usually something like security has this requirement that must be met to meet the security requirements, and then maybe marketing is trying to do this thing that doesn't align well with those security requirements. So oftentimes you're going to require a little bit of negotiation, a little bit of creative problem solving to say, okay, security, what is it really that you need to lock down? What's really important? What are the rules? What are our constraints as an organization on what we need to lock down? And then working with marketing and saying, hey, what is it that you need to put out there? What actually do you need to put out there versus everything that you wish you could put out there? And then coming up with some creative ways to maybe securing the parts that need to be secure and making public the parts that we want to be public. So everybody kind of meets their needs. We're as secure as we need to be, but marketing still gets their stuff out there. What techniques do you use to elicit requirements from non-technical stakeholders? Modeling. My answer is always modeling when it comes to requirements. Putting information in a way that's easy to digest and conceptualize, whether it's a process flow, whether it's a context diagram, whether it's a concept diagram, whether it's a sequence diagram, whether it's a data flow diagram. All those types of diagram help people visualize all the things that are happening in the context of their space and help give you better answers to the things that you need to understand because they now understand what you need to get to deliver a system that works well. So for me, it's all about models, wireframes and prototypes included. Can you explain how to create a process flowchart? What tools have you used for this? Yeah, process flows to me are pretty straightforward. There's really three critical elements. There's the start and end points, there are activities, and then there are gates. Activities are tasks that need to be done. Gates are decisions that happen along the way that determine what things happen when and when decisions need to be made. When you're creating a process flow map, you're really walking through the steps in a process and asking yourself, what happens after this task? Does this always happen after this task? If not, what are the circumstances in which that task is broken up into different paths? And then that's your gate. And then as you go on and on and on, you see all the different things that happen that take you from point A to point B and the decisions that have to happen along the way, which will help you kind of decide how things could be more efficient. That's at the base level. You could take it up a level higher and add swim lanes, and pools essentially to let you know who's doing what and when a little bit more clearly, which allows you to do things like automate. If you see that maybe a human is doing a bunch of steps and when you look at those steps, a machine could easily do them, or it could be, you can create logic or algorithms that can do those steps, or maybe some of those steps can happen in parallel. They don't have to wait on one another. It allows you to see all those things in kind of concert and make better decisions on how you want the solution to work in the future. Describe a situation where you identified inefficiencies in a business process. How did you document and improve it? Yeah, so oftentimes, which, very recently I was working with a legal team who wanted us to essentially put their out of system processes into a system. And oftentimes when you're dealing with processes that don't exist in the system, it gets really loosey-goosey on who does what where and when. And sometimes people do redundant things without even realizing it. And in talking with this group about their processes, I could immediately start to hear things that are going to be redundant, things that could be made more efficient. And so the first order of business was documenting that process to the best of my ability, going back to that team and saying, hey, when you guys were explaining the processes, this is what I saw. These are the things you're kind of doing at the same time. Maybe, can we do this sooner? Does this have to happen at the same time? Does this have to wait on that? And we found a lot of efficiencies where when you're doing something on paper, step one has to happen and then you pass it to the next person and pass it to the next person. Whereas if you gather a bunch of information up front in a system, that information can start going to all the different places it needs to go. And it doesn't have to wait in sequence if there are things that we don't have to wait for. So we found a lot of efficiencies there, and it really improved their processes. What is gap analysis and how do you conduct it for a new system implementation? Gap analysis is simply how we are today, how we want to function in the future, and what needs to happen in between to get us there. That is the gap analysis. And so, for example, if we were talking about jogging, right? Today, maybe I could run an 8-minute mile. Tomorrow, I want to be able to run a 6-minute mile. The gap is that 2-minute mile, that 2-minute mile pace. And so how can I get there? What do I need to do? What needs to change about my system to help get me there? Same things are true in a business. Oftentimes, if a business wants to transform in some kind of way, or they want to transform a process in some kind of way, whether it's automating something, whether it's making something a little bit more systematic, whether it's using data to process something a little bit more intelligently. It's really how do we get to that future state? Sometimes it involves integrating with other systems. Sometimes it involves automating tasks. Sometimes it involves capturing information in systems. Sometimes it involves creating new triggers and workflows that didn't exist before that allow things to happen in a more systematic way. And all of those changes to help you get from point A to point B is the gap analysis. Can you provide an example where you identified gaps between the current state and the desired future state? I think a simple recent example is we wanted a system where we had a system that had a lot of extraneous data, a lot of data that it didn't need. And the owners, the stakeholders of that system wanted to clean that data up. They wanted it out. The challenge was the data that was in that system didn't come from that system. That system wasn't the record of reference. And the way the processes worked in our organization, that system had to get information from the record of reference. And so in order to change how that system or the kind of information that system got, changes needed to happen in outside systems. So we had to determine what all changes needed to exist so that this system that has way too much extraneous information only has the information that it needs. In some cases, it meant changing the interface to filter out certain levels of information. In some cases, it meant working with the stakeholders of those record of reference systems to understand why they might have to send the data the way that they do. Can they make changes to facilitate our ability to filter out the things that we need? And that also had to happen as well. Fortunately for us, the overall owners of all the different systems was a singular owner, so it was easy to kind of convince them to make those changes. And that's how we went about doing it. We identified the gaps, we identified what we wanted to be differently, all the systems that needed to be involved for our little ecosystem to behave differently, and then went and attacked all those little pieces one by one. How do you analyze and interpret large data sets to support business decisions? Well, it's really about business objective, business goals, and being able to find trends, right? And so if your goal is more revenue, what are the things that are revenue generating? What are the things that get in the way of that revenue generation? Costs, being able to see trends in those costs. When are costs higher? When are costs lower? When does revenue go up? When does revenue go down? What causes those ups and downs? Are there things that we can do to make the ups more often and the downs less often? And so you're really looking at the data and comparing it to what the business goals are and trying to find trends in that data that say, hey, when these things are true, that's when we're getting the things we want. When these things are true, that's when we're not getting the things we want. So how do we mitigate the things we don't want and express more of the things that we do want? What experience do you have with data visualization tools like Tableau, Power BI, or Excel? I have a little bit of experience with all of those, probably the most experience with Excel because that's just the easiest to access. Tableau and Power BI kind of depend on the organization that you're working with. Some use Tableau, some use Power BI, some use a mixture of both. Both of those applications also have a cost, so oftentimes you have to justify your own license to be able to use those types of tools. As a business analyst, it's usually not that hard to justify that, but you do have to justify it. Whereas Excel, usually everybody in the company is going to get Excel. So the more you could do with Excel, the less hassle you're going to have on yourself. So I've done a lot of work with Excel, To me, the most important thing about Excel is knowing what it's capable of, because you may not always remember exactly how to do it. But if you know that it's capable of doing it, you could always look it up really quick, whether it's a YouTube video, whether it's a tutorial from Microsoft itself. If you know it's there, you could usually accomplish it in a few quick steps. And so Excel is probably the one I use the most. With Tableau and BI, for the most part, it's about the fun in visualizing it. For me, Excel is about just analysis, comparing, extracting, transferring, loading, that kind of activities where I just want to manipulate, slice, and dice. Whereas tools like Tableau allow much more robust visualization, where if you're dealing with geographical data, you could visualize it geographically. You could visualize things by size in multiple dimensions really easy. And I actually do find that visualizing in Tableau and Power BI is much faster and easier than figuring out how to do it with all the charts and things in Excel. What business analysis tools are you proficient in? Probably most of them. In the shop that I'm in today, we're using mostly Jira, Confluence, Excel, diagramming. If you're a Microsoft user, you have Visio at present. I use a MacBook for work, so Visio is not available. So I use things like Draw.io, Lucid Charts, or Glyphy, depending on the ecosystem in which I'm creating that diagram. I also am proficient in prototyping tools like Figma, to create wireframes and interactive prototypes, but that's because I have a UX background. And then, of course, the Microsoft Office suite, Teams, all those types of things. But what I've found is, as a business analyst, as long as you know what you need to produce, most of the tools could produce it or help you facilitate producing it pretty quickly and easily, so it's easy to adapt to whatever new tools are out there. This next section is going to be about scenario-based questions. So let's take a look. A system you've helped design fails to meet user expectations. What steps would you take to resolve this? Obviously, I would reach out to the stakeholders who are disappointed in whatever we've delivered and try to figure out where it is that we missed the mark. It's never good to feel like you've missed a mark, but it's going to happen. And the important thing is how you recover from that, how you learn from that. You need to take the time to understand why you missed it in the first place. Did you miss talking to a stakeholder? Did you not properly think through the processes and all the tasks and all the gotchas and all the negative scenarios? What was it that you missed? And work with that stakeholder to really get them to explain to you why the current solution doesn't meet the requirements. Because one, you don't want to have a second solution that also doesn't meet the requirements, but it's also an opportunity to gain a better understanding of the business domain, how those users expect to interact with the system, and document some of that information so that way you can ensure that you, not just yourself, but the team understands what the expectations are and could deliver a better solution in the future. How do you write user stories and acceptance criteria in Agile projects? This doesn't feel like a scenario-based question at all, but to answer the question, when I write a user story, I always use as a, I want, so that. That allows me to understand who I'm writing that user story for, what it is that they want, and the value that it's intended to deliver. That way, if there's ever questions on why are we doing this, why did we do that in the past, you could easily see that from the user story itself, as well as when you're solutioning, when the team is working on the solution, they can see that statement and say, hey, you said the reason you're doing this is to provide this value and you want this thing, but did you know that there's this other thing that provides that same value, which gives you a chance to maybe have additional conversations with stakeholders and end users to see what the best possible solution is. If we're talking about the invest model here, that would be the negotiable. You're writing it in such a way that you really focus on the value that you need to deliver versus the function of what you want to deliver. And when we're talking about acceptance criteria, my teams have adopted using Gherkin, which I enjoy because it forces you to think about scenarios and what things need to be true for that scenario to go from point A to point B. And so it's a critical thinking exercise to say, okay, given all of these things are true, when this activity happens, these are the things that should be true after the fact, which forces you to think about, okay, what if those things aren't all true? What should happen then? What are all the different scenarios for this user story? And so I like to use given, when, then, just because it forces you to think a little bit more critically, and also about negative scenarios and lateral scenarios and all those things that may not pop out at you if you're just writing things like the system must do that, then must do that, then must do that. Can you describe your role in an agile development team and how you interact with the product owner and Scrum Master? Sure. As a business analyst, your role is really to bring clarity around the complexity that is the organization. In a small organization or a small startup kind of team, you probably don't even need a business analyst. The product owner knows what they want to deliver, the team knows how to deliver it. Usually a business analyst exists because you're an ecosystem with a lot of complexity, right? A bunch of processes that you might need to touch that might break things for other people, data that's used in all kinds of different systems, people who are interacting with these systems in all different ways. So your job as a business analyst is really to bring clarity around all those things. So that way the team, from the product owner who has to make decisions, as well as the team who's delivering solutions, understand the ecosystem that they're working in. And one, we don't break things along the way, and we're really just improving the entire ecosystem. Relative to the Scrum Master, it's a very similar relationship to a project manager. You're really two peas in a pod, right? You're working together for the success of the team. From a BA's perspective, you're really focused on the success of the product and it not breaking anything. And from the Scrum Master's perspective, it's the success of the team in delivering continuous value in an agile manner without all the anti-patterns. Describe how you've managed expectations when a project scope changed midway. This happens all the time. It's something you should expect to happen all the time. You learn new things, things will change, things get missed. People are going to want things to change. And so anytime something changes in the near term, whether it's Agile or Waterfall, and Agile is really changing something in the scope of a sprint. In Waterfall, it's requirements changing after requirements have been signed off on. And it's really having a conversation with the stakeholders on what is the priority, how are those things aligning to the objective, and what things now are going to be different because we're going to be changing things, right? If you change something midway, that means either timelines are not going to get met, quality is going to diminish if you still have to meet those timelines, or the scope is going to have to come down in some kind of way, right? And so having that full conversation so people understand, okay, we're going to backtrack a little bit, we're going to change things. That means we can't move as quickly, or we can't deliver as much. So what are we going to do now that we're changing things? And sometimes those changes are totally necessary. Maybe the environment changed. Maybe you learned something new through the course of the development work, and you have to make those changes. So you have to be prepared to make those kind of decisions and try to make good decisions to put you in the best place. So whenever you get to whatever that deadline is, you're ready to move on to the next thing productively. How do you ensure all stakeholders are aligned and engaged throughout a project? Cadence. Cadence, cadence, cadence. If people are important, and it's important to keep people involved and engaged, you need to have cadence. In Agile, cadence is kind of built into the kind of mentality of it, and so people expect it. But you're meeting with the team daily to see where they're at, see what they're working on. You're seeing things get developed. When you're talking about stakeholders, people who care about the end outcome, you build in cadences, whether it's at the end of every sprint, talking about what was done, letting them see the end result so they can make new decisions, or it's along the sprint, maybe every Friday, every Monday, 3 times a week, whatever it is. You set up a cadence that's appropriate for that stakeholder, so that way they're in the know, they're making the right decisions, and they can also stop you if you're moving in the wrong direction. This section is the technical knowledge questions, so let's see how we do. Can you write a SQL query to retrieve specific data from multiple tables? I will candidly say that I'm not a super user in SQL. I can do basic joins using foreign keys and associating data in tables, as long as I am aware of the table structure and the names of the columns and such. So I could do some basic retrieval and joins in SQL, but I would not say that I'm a SQL guru, because I usually have people who are much more technical than me who could do it much more faster than I can. And I tend to want to build systems that make reporting and retrieval easy. And so I build it in such a way that I can get that information without having to do a lot of querying. However, if I have to, I can understand SQL queries. I can understand the syntax of SQL. And so if somebody gives me a query to kind of look through the data, I could usually manipulate that query to get to the exact things that I want. How would you clean and reprocess raw data for analysis? So usually when you're talking about raw data, you're talking about data that a system can easily read, but maybe a person cannot. And so you're usually doing things like manipulating data to say, okay, maybe we're using these user IDs that are not really easy to understand. Let me tie in some actual first names and last names, maybe job titles, roles, regions, things that help me understand the data a little bit more than just maybe numerical values. So translating things that are easily read by a system into things that are easily read by a human being, and then combining information that might be coming from different places that will make it easy to see things in aggregate, maybe run some pivot tables, things like that, that allow you to combine data, transform that data, and then organize it in such a way that it's meaningful to you. So it's usually making it more human readable and then combining information that's useful together for you to get the answers that you need. Explain how you would design and document the requirements for a new software application. Well, I would start from the business requirements, whatever that is. And so if I'm the business analyst, that usually means I wasn't the one who came up with the idea for this project. Somebody said this is a thing that we want to do. And now I'm the business analyst to help us do the right thing. And so I would ask, what are the key things that we want this system to do at a high level? Those are the business requirements. And then from there, kind of start the functional decomposition of, okay, at a high level, you want it to be able to do this. What are the sub things? What are the sub functions or solution requirements that need to exist for you to be able to meet that business requirement, and break that down all the way down to the smallest increment that makes sense for the project type we're in. In waterfall, that means business requirement to stakeholder requirement to solution requirements. In Agile, that might mean a feature that's broken down into epics, that's broken down into user stories, and then keeping that organized so that way we can kind of see the big picture as well as all the things that break down to that smaller picture. And then as we build it out, you usually find spaces where, okay, well, all of these requirements, whether they're user stories or whatever they may be, align to a specific process. So then you also document those things like data models, business processes, so people can have that kind of big picture idea of what things need to be done. So as you're moving through the project, people understand where we're supposed to be going, what the end result is kind of supposed to look like. And then as you go, you kind of just evolve that. How do you differentiate between functional and non-functional requirements? I personally like to differentiate them by kind of saying functional is what we want the system to do, the actual step-by-step things that we want the system to accomplish, whereas non-functional really relate to the quality in which that it does those things. And quality is around the entire ecosystem, right? So it could mean usability, meaning we're using usable colors, we're minimizing confusion, using language that the user understands, et cetera, and so forth for usability. But it also means things like maintainability. If we build it in this way, if it breaks, is it really difficult to fix? Do we need to build it in a different way that is easier to fix? Serviceability, scalability. Right now, the way it's modeled, it can handle 10 at a time. If in the future we want to grow to 100 at a time, will it be able to handle that? Should we build it differently so that way it could scale to 100? So things like serviceability, maintainability, scalability, usability, all the abilities that really go to the quality of the product versus the actual function that you want it to do. And now it looks like we'll be closing it out with some behavioral and experience-based questions. Tell me about a time you delivered a successful solution despite unclear initial requirements. Well, there was a time that I had to build a solution for something that didn't ever exist. It was kind of a transition requirement where something used to exist in the old system. It wasn't going to exist in that way anymore. Everybody was moving to a new system, and this was kind of an interim thing. So we didn't need it to be what it was before. It just needed to be something that helped people get over the gap, essentially. And the requirements came from somebody who didn't really fully understand what was done before. They just understood that we didn't want people to be essentially leave people in the dark or leave people out in the cold. And so at the time, I was very focused on UX, user experience design. That was where I was at in my career. I was trying to build that skill set. So I kind of approached it with a lean kind of UX mentality. One, I used prototypes and wireframes. So I started out with prototypes and wireframes, and then I started sharing it. I started letting people click through it. I started saying, hey, if you were doing this job and you needed this information, would this do it for you? Would this help you get to where you want it to be? And then after some feedback and some back and forth with different people and talking to different stakeholders, we settled on something that would work. And that solution ended up being in place for several years. And it helped a lot of people kind of get over the hump of new acquisition, essentially. And I was pretty proud of myself because it was one of the first times I really tried to go through that user experience process and build something and prototype and go through that iteration with people kind of real time. So I actually really enjoyed that. And it's something that's like a little highlight in my memory. It wasn't the best solution that I've ever created in my career. It was just the first time that I tried it and it was a success. Share an example of when you had to push back on a stakeholder's unrealistic expectations. Well, this happens all the time. Most recently, a stakeholder essentially didn't want to release a product until all of these things were done. And the problem was we were releasing a product for a bunch of stakeholders that weren't really able to give us the full input of all the nuances of the things that they wanted to do. And so that left us in kind of a place of we either could deliver what we have today, which we know isn't 100% of what the stakeholders will want, or we could wait until all the stakeholders give us the time to deliver the most robust solution possible. And the reality was we needed to deliver something sooner rather than later. And so I had to reality check them and say, hey, if we want to deliver something to these stakeholders that works and that allows them to do their job, it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to allow us to start gathering that information to get to perfect. This is what we're going to have to do now. And a lot of times when you're negotiating like this, you need to put it in the words of, from the perspective of their success, right? If you say, hey, you could put something out there now, get 50% success and learn from that 50% success to get you to 100%, or you can deliver zero value for the next few months until you get to some unknown time where everything is perfect. Which do you prefer? And when you put it in terms of their success, it's usually a much easier conversation. Describe how you've presented your analysis or findings to senior management. Usually when I'm really presenting to anybody, just like in the last question, is really all about their perspective. What's important to them? What are they trying to accomplish? What are their goals? And how does what I've done align to those goals? One of the things that's hard to anticipate when you're talking to senior leadership is how far they'll want to dig down. So you should just assume that they'll want to dig to the bottom, and also assume that some people they might want to just stay right at the top. And so you kind of decompose your presentation to say, at a high level, these are my findings. These are the things that align to your goals. These are the decisions that you can make based on the data, and these are the impacts of those decisions. If you want to dig a little bit deeper into that, here's a more detailed view of the specifics of this data, how I gathered it, etc., and so forth. And if you want to dig even further than that, then here's the specifics on that. And depending on who you're working with, in my experience, I found people who just want to stay up here and they're like, yep, that's perfect. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. I like what you're doing. Let's move forward. And there's some people who start asking a bunch of questions. And then you say, I got you. If you want to go to that level of detail, let's go to this other view that'll help answer a lot of those questions for you that you may have. This happens a lot when you're doing analysis at the beginning of a project and they really want to know where you're going with that project. And as the business analyst, you've likely done a lot of the analysis work. So rather than your manager presenting on your behalf, they just bring you in and say, hey, come to this meeting with all these leaders and tell them what you found and tell them how it impacts them. And then now you have to put this hat on and say, okay, I don't know who's going to be in the room, so let me prepare for anybody being in that room. That was me answering ChatGPT's technical interview or business analysis interview questions. If you found that useful, give me a thumbs up. If you have any additional questions, whether it's about the questions I answered in this video, my answers to those questions, or maybe any additional business analysis related question, whether it's about interviewing or just the job in general, let me know in the comments and I'll either answer you there or create a whole new video just like this one to answer your questions. So subscribe to see your questions get answered. And as always, thanks for watching.